Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the Sunday stream number 8. I cannot believe that we've been doing this now consecutively for 8 weeks, 2 months. Things are going great. I hope that everyone is having a wonderful Sunday so far, and that things have been good to you so far over the course of the last week since we last spoke. Let's just let everyone know that we're going live, and we can get things started. So with everyone just pouring into chat, let me know how everyone's doing, how the audio's going, and I hope that everyone's having a good time so far. I'm glad that you're all here. But yeah, things are doing pretty well. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad that all of you guys are coming on in. I thought that this week we would take things a little bit easier this time rather than be covering some international affairs news, because there's certainly a lot that we could go into. And I thought that it would be important for us to take a step back and take a look at some of the more bare bones and the bare basics when it comes to international relations and geopolitical theory. I think that it's important for us to have a strong background of sort of the fundamentals, the frameworks, the basic building blocks for a realist school of understanding, which I think for many of us who take a look at international affairs, it's important that we view things in a realist school. Those who view things from the lens of idealism are typically more along the lines of that Woodrow Wilsonian liberalism that we see in the international world order. And I think it's important that we have a good understanding of some of the fundamentals that differentiate us between that Wilsonian idealism that seems to dominate the neoliberal politics of our day-to-day events, especially with foreign policy, because let's be honest, while we may not have as much control over foreign affairs, it's important, much like with economics and other aspects of our history and other disciplines, that we have an understanding of both our own ideas as well as the ideas of those around us. So yeah, it'll be a good time for us to get started, and we'll be talking about all of this stuff real shortly. I figured that we would start with, of course, the basic announcements, how the channel's doing, how everyone else is doing in chat. Then we'll get on to the lecture, and then we'll, of course, conclude with the frog of the week and any super chats at the end. So, yeah, here we go. This is quickly becoming a Sunday mainstay, and always glad to get more Settlers Lament content. Oh, well, you know, Patrick, it's between Settlers, myself, Charlemagne, and Turnip where we all sound the same, so I'm sure Settler will be happy to know that another person thinks that we all sound the same. But yeah, I'm glad that you're all here. So let's all get started. And yes, Wilson is cringe forest bomber. That's why we're learning about realism and the importance of the realist school of international thought and relations. And that's what I have in plan in store for you all today. Because taking a look at everything that's happened in the last couple of weeks, we could spend hours talking about what's currently going on in Israel, but I figured that for the sake of sort of larger scale picture things, I think it'd be important to step back and take a look at more, fundamentals and concepts besides the feedback we got from the last time that we went over theories such as that of offensive realism. It went really well. But anyways, some channel announcements. We've crossed over 1,800 subs, so thank you guys. I'm really appreciative of all the growth. I think we're going to cross over 2,000 subs by the end of the month, so I'm really happy with how things are going there. In addition to that, we had another episode of Real Talk that came out yesterday, so if you haven't had that, you can take a break from the politics, you can take a break from the international affairs, and watch a very cozy fishing video talking about Walden, Henry David Thoreau, and the importance of taking care of yourself and your mental health by, appreciating nature and appreciating what's outside. Sort of a play on the words of the phrase, touch grass. So if you haven't seen that, go check that out. It's on the channel. You can find it there. In addition to that, we do have some upcoming stream appearances that I'm going to let you all know of. On the 19th, so this coming Wednesday, I will be on Apostolic Majesty's channel. We'll be talking about Otto von Bismarck. So it'll be similar to the stream I was on with him when we talked about Clemens von Metternich. And it'll be a discussion of just sort of, his foreign policy, his conservatism in the age of, European revolutions and liberalism. So that should be a good time. So I'll let AM put the announcement out on that one. But on the 19th, I'll be over on AM's channel talking about Bismarck. On the 29th, we will be doing an episode of Prudent Reads. And it will be with Mr. Patriarch. So he'll be coming on. And we will be discussing Machiavelli's The Prince. So if you haven't read The Prince, I think it's a relatively short read. I've read it a few times already. And if not, he's got a great video series on his channel about the various chapters of The Prince. You should go check them out. So on the 29th, so not this Saturday, but Saturday the next, we'll be talking about Machiavelli's The Prince. And then on the 30th, so the last Sunday stream of the month, I will have Kevin Doremus, who is a PhD student in international affairs and relations, and we'll be talking about Russian grand strategy and neoclassical views in foreign policy and statecraft. So I will have once again another guest coming on the Sunday stream who is a subject matter expert and has, significant credentials in international relations and comparative politics. So the 30th is going to be a really special treat for you guys. So in 2 weeks, keep your eyes open. We're going to have a really good time. And in between that, I do plan on having some more scripted content out in the meantime, but that's what I currently have going on for the channel and announcements. And then this Tuesday, the 18th, I will also be once again on Break the Rules, talking about democracy and having a conversation with a few people that used to work for the World Economic Forum. So I'm really excited that Lev and Gio want me back on. As always, it's a great time, and I will have links in the description at the end of the show to keep you guys abroad of what's going on and to keep you all appraised of new information. So with all that being said, I'm really thankful with how things are going, and I'm glad that you all have, decided to stick around and watch me grow and watch the channel grow. So I'm incredibly happy to see how things are doing. And we, of course, have a thing tomorrow. That's absolutely true. Thank you for reminding me, DC. On Monday, we will have another episode of Discordant Dragons on Yiz the Eunuch's channel. Myself, DC Perspective, and Don the Pleb will be on. So if you like either of us, by all means, stop on by. It'll be a fun time. I really like doing the whole D&D skit thing, explaining the world events in a sort of Dungeons and Dragons setting. So that'll be tomorrow afternoon, starting 5 o'clock Eastern. So you should definitely stop by and use the Eunuch's channel for a little fun poking and prodding at, the day's news events. It's a fun show. I've been on it a couple of times. You should really give it a watch because it's a lot of lighthearted fun. And I think for a lot of us that cover, the day-to-day's events or talk about politics or any sort of conceptual stuff politically, it's always important to have a little bit of fun with it all. Yes, Manoa, and thank God there's no discussion about the importance of carrot access to the stability of authoritarian regimes. No, we won't be talking about agriculture. One of these days we will. But, yeah, no, don't worry about it. We'll be perfectly fine talking about theory and the day's events of what's going on. So that being said, that's all the announcements. That's all I have. I hope that everyone else is doing pretty well. And no, Shrouded. Well, I mean, once you get to know Yiz, you'll understand why that's not a BreadTube name. But you'll have to talk to her about that. It's not my place to tell. But no, she is the furthest thing that you could get from a BreadTuber. She's great. So with all that being said, and the announcements are out of the way, let me start sharing my screen, and we can get started with today's lecture. So yeah, let's get started. All right, so here we are, and let's begin. So today we're going to be talking about power transition theory from the infamous Kenneth Organski, who's well known for his views on power transition, how wars are fought in sort of the long cycle of hegemonic stability, and how, certain powers and hegemonic challengers come to rise into power, how the economic growth develops, the influence of how hegemony is acquired by nation states, and how that affects the existing international order from existing power structures. So let's start with his quote that I have here for the beginning. "We have learned that the major determinants of national power are population size, political efficiency, and the degree of industrialization. It is the shifts in such areas as these that lead to changes in the distribution of power." A.F.K. Organski. So this is going to be a conversation as to what makes powers, on the international stage, develop the necessary means to challenge the existing international order, and by extension, how that leads to conflict and by extension, war. So with that being said, let's get into it. So let's start off by giving a little bit of background of A.F.K. Organski and his power transition theory. So Organski is like a lot of foreign policy critics and schools of thought that come out of the post-war and early war period. Albremo Fimo Kenneth Organski, born 1923, died 1998. He was he fled Italy, if you couldn't tell by his name, during Mussolini's years. During the time in which there was a lot more anti-Semitic laws that were coming out of fascist Italy and fascist Germany. Of course, we had a widespread diaspora of Jewish and other minority academics that came to the United States during this time. Organski was one of them. He wrote a variety of books, including The World Politics, The War Ledger, The $36 Billion Bargain, and The Stages of Political Development. His most famous contribution, of course, to the school of, foreign affairs and international relations, and most importantly, the realist school of thought, is the development of power transition theory in 1958. It has been expanded on by others, such as famous scholars like Robert Gilpin and others, but this is what he's most well known for. And during this time, he did get his PhD in the 1940s from the University of Michigan, and where he had stayed for the rest of his academic career. He was founded a variety of geopolitical forecasting works. He was a research scholar. He wrote numerous papers through journals throughout his academic career, and was a senior research fellow at the Institute for Social Research. Now, if you're familiar with the Institute for Social Research, yes, he was a member of the Frankfurt School. He was aware of critical theory at the time. But that shouldn't discount you from understanding his work or what he's contributed. A lot of people that we may disagree with politically still provide numerous theories and concepts that are worth understanding. For the same way that I've done videos on Deleuze and Guattari, on reterritorialization, there are a variety of people whose ideas we may disagree with politically that we should still interrogate and understand, because their contributions definitely shape the way that we view the world around us. But that's just a little bit of background on Organski. If you went to Michigan, you may have seen his name around in various political science departments, and that's where we're at. But yeah, so his theory, of course, came in 1958 in his famous book, World Politics. And the central claim, of course, is that the international system is usually hierarchical, ordered with a dominant power at the top that creates and sustains an international order, that because of uneven rates and growth in the economy, new powers are always rising. And that always includes the risk of wars at the highest situation, when someone is incredibly disaffected or dissatisfied with the current existing international order. So when they've reached a level of parity in power, either through military or economic means, that's when they usually challenge the declining dominant power in the international system, if they feel it no longer benefits them, or they have the ability to change the international system. Essentially, the chance of conflict arises when the distribution of political, military, and economic power is even across hegemonic powers, as these nation states are likely to challenge the dominant system from the existing superpower that's already in progress and ruling the international order. You'll often see these in conversations about hegemonic stability theory, and specifically like long cycle theory. So long cycle theory being that there are these long periods of waves of international order that are being led primarily by one nation and their sphere of influence, or their, hegemonic sphere of influence with other countries and allies, usually through trade agreements, through military alliances, and so on. This theory very much challenges the claims of others that believe that the world is primarily anarchic. So Mearsheimer deviates from Organski in the idea that Organski believes that whoever's in charge, whoever has the most military power, determines the international order. Whereas Mearsheimer will tell you that, yes, you can have international order, but regardless of which, because there's no national or international or transnational sovereign, the world is inherently anarchic. So there's this already central difference we see between sort of the neo-realists, the offensive realists, and the more classical realists like Organski, that believe that there is more hierarchy and more international order than one likes to believe. So we're seeing with a more classical viewpoint that there's more structured order inside of the international system. And in part, we see this with hegemonic stability theory, that, there's a lot more sustainable levels of peace in the world when there's primarily groups or, blocks of hegemonic powers that are sort of controlling certain parts of the world or international trade. So we're seeing a lot of this in here. And in the future, we'll probably go into depth on both of these concepts of hegemonic stability theory and long cycle theory. But Organski plays within these schools of thought. And so here we go. So let's go into power transition theory in depth. So, like, Organski believes that whoever's really in charge, or whoever's the dominant hegemon of the world, or even in a region, they're the ones that provide the relative peace and order, at least on a grand scale. There's still going to be conflict, especially in minor areas, or what we would consider maybe the third world, if we want to look at this from a Cold War perspective. But if the dominant power and its allies can maintain firm control of the international system, primarily through the military and through trade, you're going to achieve a relatively grand world order scale of peace, because you have the ability to maintain control of institutions, maintain control of trade, the distribution of resources and capital, things that are necessary for nation states to more or less function and prosper in any sort of international system, whether that's through the systems of monarchies, whether that's through a Congress system, whether that's through, of course, during his time, the emergence of what we call the liberal world order, or, through the United Nations and international trade organizations like the WTO. Organski believes that challengers in these challenges emerge from dissatisfaction from the international order, which is often designed to keep potential challengers to the existing hegemon blocked out. Now, of course, this premise is often seen in realist schools. It's not pessimism, it's realism. The reason why I say that is because a lot of criticism that you'll get from realist schools of foreign policy and international relations is that it always seems to err on the likelihood that conflict is always going to occur. It always breaks from that idealist perspective that diplomacy or trade or some kind of agreement can be eked out. The big primarily difference is, that sort of cup half full or half empty kind of deal. The realist will always say that the cup is half empty, or at least in my opinion, right? Because that's how we view it. The cup is half empty because, well, the cup is half empty. It's been, drank out of or whatever. The idealism of it being half full always relies on that, ignorance of history, in my personal opinion. Realism, in my view, and I think the view of many others, as we'll explore on this channel and when we have other guests on, is that history is always going to be your greatest indicator of what's happened in the past, is what most likely is going to happen again. Not that necessarily history is cyclical, although it certainly can be if you adhere to certain views, whether that's Spengler or others. But the simple fact is that we've seen through time and time again that we have international orders and we have systems of power and trade and organization that are meant to keep possible contenders blocked out. We've seen this even more recently with the expansion of NATO post-dissolution of the Soviet Union. So we know for sure that great powers do what they can to keep the potential challenger from ever, having a say within the international order and system that the main hegemon designs. And we see this on the right here with this little pyramid. The dominant nation is at the top, and we have this sort of sliding parabola, sort of triangle coming up on a curve here about who's satisfied and dissatisfied. Whoever's in that smaller part of this, like a food pyramid at the top here, the great powers. So in, say, this instance, we have the United States, the dominant nation, then we have like Russia, we have India, we have China and others, or potentially your BRIC nations and the middle powers and smaller powers in the regional areas. There's going to be a certain group of them that are dissatisfied with the existing order, but only those that have the capacity to project a significant amount of power that are within that system, those are labeled as challengers. Those are potential countries to look out for that could challenge the international system. But what's the most important for us that Organski talks about, as we mentioned the quote at the beginning, is that the rate of a nation's growth and the ability to maintain that growth plays a substantial role in the likelihood for conflict. So the great way that he talks about this is that nations that industrialize first, they'll primarily maintain their dominant position in the world, but nations that they work with that end up industrializing and developing military capacity later in their cycles of development will then become the most likely challenged, the more likely to challenge the international system. He cites this in the same way that the United Kingdom, the British Empire, they industrialized first. However, it would be the United States that industrializes later and takes advantage of the fact that there's already an international system in place to eventually challenge and surpass and usurp the United Kingdom in its ability to be a global hegemon. Of course, there are wars that take place, but it's this fact that latter industrialization does play a role, and it can take decades, if not a century, for this to catch up. So we can already see how the ability to maintain economic growth, the industrialization, and actually maintain that industrialization in a way that keeps government working, keeps the population healthy, and the ability to wage war if necessary, and of course the ability to project power through economic means as well as their own security apparatus. But it's the ability to maintain that growth. If you can't maintain it, or the international system that is trying to block you out can successfully prevent you from having access to the necessary growth to project power, then the likelihood for conflict decreases. So you have to be able to maintain your economic growth while at the same time converting that growth to the means to project power. And that's what makes this theory important to understand and differentiates it from others, is that it's the ability to maintain the economic growth and the ability to convert that into power. And if you can convert it into power and you're dissatisfied with the economic system or the international order, then you are more likely to challenge it. Those challenges are usually seen historically through, hot and kinetic conflict. Other times, not so much. It can be done through international trade pressure. But historically, as Organski points out, and through other scholars like Gilpin and others, it mainly leads to some sort of military conflict. The balance of power, conceptually, as we've referred to the past with Clemens Metternich in sort of the Congress system with the Congress of Vienna and the system of the balance of power inside Europe, it does not last long, because eventually that international system is going to start asking questions about other powers in the region. So in the same way that the Eastern question became a question for European statesmen about the Ottoman Empire, eventually the idea to maintain a balance of power between various groups and hegemonic powers within that region eventually gives out, and war eventually breaks out. But yeah, and that's where we're at so far. But now let's continue. So now we're going to talk about the rates of growth, the likelihood of conflict, and positions of power. Organski argues that states grow unevenly, with the posterior ones growing faster than earlier industrialized nations. So nations that, involve in trade or colonial practices, odds are in the future their colonies are going to be the ones that surpass them on the international stage and will eventually project more power. Now, the most common example, of course, is the United States, between that of the United Kingdom. However, he argues and postulates in the 1950s that you're going to see this happen with other countries, primarily within Asia. So he cites Japan and China, that their rapid industrialization post-war and post-European industrialization will make them significant global powers within the future, within the next 100 years, so around the 2050s timeframe. But again, it's always this idea that whoever, gets to take advantage of the development and the industrialization of a country second. So if I can learn from the mistakes of another institution or learn how their institutions are being developed, take advantage of the technological growth and development, and better myself and my people, then I'm going to be in a position later and stronger to challenge them. Now, there are various other aspects that we talked about, or that Organski talks about. This includes, birth rates, population size, the ability for these people to maintain a healthy population, so infant mortality rates, the health of the overall economy and their people are vital. And of course, industrialization in an aggregate usually takes care of this. This is also associated with various regulations that keep the people healthy. So, environmental policy, health policy, access to those sort of medications, and access to markets and research and development. There are a variety of factors in which the term industrialization covers as a blanket term. However, if you manage to grow and maintain that growth, as we see with any sort of developing nation or developed state, that allows them to potentially challenge the existing order in several decades down the line if they're, unhappy with the international system. Now, keep in mind that no state is necessarily a rational actor. We know this in the realist school of thought, that we can't assume that any state is going to act rationally. Nations are never rational actors, especially because a nation is A nation is that of its people. And if the people are not acting rationally or acting in a way that we would deem to be rational, then neither can the country. Even American, even the American founders talked about this. Alexander Hamilton especially recognized that people are men of passion. People do not act rationally. They do not act in what they believe might be on paper in the interest of their country or their countrymen. So it is important to recognize that the world is inherently chaotic. You can establish order. Organski believes that you can. I mean, we've seen order be established in the past, whether it's through the East India Company, through the British Empire, through more recently the United States and its existing liberal institutions. But these things play a major role in the likelihood of how conflict can arise, especially between other countries that are now developing and putting themselves on the world stage to challenge the existing international order. That growth is vital for us to understand because, of course, resources are scarce. The distribution of said resources are not fair. It's uneven. However, those who can take advantage of the fact that these resources are uneven allows themselves to pit themselves against the current existing international order if they are dissatisfied. That dissatisfaction is critical alongside their rate of development and when they start to really industrialize as a country. So through a power transition, later industrializing nations approach and maybe even overtake the dominant country, which generally results in a war and finally leads to global power shifts and power distribution. Now, these later industrializing countries approach and overtake the dominant institutions in a variety of ways. It doesn't always happen on a global scale. Organski talks about sort of the partition of India and its independence from the United Kingdom, talking about how these industrializing and developing nations can overtake the dominant country, or at least overtake it in its dominant political system. As we'll talk about later, it is usually not the dominant country that engages in these kinds of conflicts, whether it's diplomatic, military, or economic. It is usually the weaker or challenging country that initiates these power plays against the dominant industrialized institutional order in the world. War doesn't always happen as the last option. It's usually not the rationally right, or historically we always see war as sort of this option of last resort. No one wants to go to war first. However, that's not always the first option. Sometimes it's the first choice. War doesn't always often occur, but it is a recurring pattern per this theory. As we talked about in the past, realists will always look to what is the historical indicator, what has happened in the past, what has happened based upon these similar, sets of variables and factors. And if war happened in the past, odds are war will happen again. So we sort of see that cyclical or wave-like function of realist school of thought come into this theory, where we talk about how war may not happen as the last resort, but it definitely can occur as conflict with these instances regarding resources, political power, and influence generally lead to military conflict, as we've seen in the past. So to quote from Organski's work, "It might be expected that a wise challenger growing in power through internal development would hold back from threatening the existing international order until it had reached a point where it was as powerful as the dominant nation. For surely it would seem foolish to attack while weaker than the enemy. If this expectation were correct, the risk of war would be the greatest when two opposing camps were almost equal in power, and if war broke out before this point, it would take the form of a preventative war launched by the dominant nation to destroy a competitor before it became strong enough to upset the existing international order. In fact, however, this was not what happened in recent history. World Wars I and II involved challengers attacking the dominant nation and its allies long before they equaled them in power, and the attack was launched by the challengers and not the dominant camp." Now, Organski talks about this a lot in world politics and in power transition theory, because it wasn't just in 1958 he's talked about this. He's talked about this in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. This has been a theory that he's worked on throughout his entire academic career. Smaller powers in turn do challenge the existing international order. Germany starts shit at least once per century. To quote Peter Hitchens, ouchie, the European Union is just another name for organized Germanism. And this is actually, we'll talk about this when we talk about historical applications of power transition theory, because one of the biggest concerns that both the United States and the Soviet Union had when they talked about the wall coming down was what would happen to Europe when Germany was unified again. And so we're actually sort of seeing power transition theory in action, both historically, but as well as in modern day applications, because we are now seeing these existing sort of challenges to the international order come from these sort of regional hegemonic states as they become to develop and, have the necessary means to challenge themselves. So yeah, don't worry, guys. I'll read through the chat in a little bit. I'm just simply going through the lecture, and we'll get into it in depth with your questions and whatnot as we continue. But yeah, it's important to understand that it's not the dominant power that acts. Sometimes it will act in preventative measure, but typically in the viewpoint of power transition theory, it is usually the weaker, not as strong power that's not yet reached parity that will challenge the international system, in part because it senses weakness and it can take advantage of its dissatisfaction, especially through rapid militarization and industrialization and the ability to convert that industrialization into a war machine. Keep in mind that from Napoleon onward, nation states have to typically engage in what's considered total war. So they have to engage in a mechanism in which the entire aspect of the civilian private sector can be transformed into a warlike economy. And which, of course, has not been, which is a relatively recent thing. It's about 200 years old. The Napoleonic conflicts are really what transforms modern global warfare into the sort of total warfare instance. And that's what we're seeing now with this aspect of challenging industrializing nations, challenging the existing world order. So yeah, that's where we're at so far with the theory. And of course, if this is kind of the sort of stuff that you like, I'm going to just pause for a second here. Do like and share the stream. Greatly appreciate it. The more thumbs up we get, the more people that can share it and see it, the more I get your suggestions on what we want to talk about in the future. And that always helps me. I get to learn. You get to learn. We get to put together great presentations. So with that being said, let's continue. So some historical examples of power transition theory. Like we talked about, the Napoleonic Wars are one of the primary examples that Organski cites. It is an interruption of the hegemonic power of the British Empire. At this point in time, the British Empire had controlled the seas. They had one of the most impressive militaries on there. And you have a challenging, rising France that, sort of industrializes later, sort of gets its stuff together later. And of course, this is due to interruptions of its political system and, of course, its economy due to the French Revolution. So it's starting at a later point than, say, the existing international order led by, of course, the British Empire. This is challenging a rising France to usurp the international order at its time. And of course, it isn't until the entire international system, through a variety of, diplomacy, statecraft, Metternich especially, you have to get essentially all of Europe to challenge the French authority here. So the entire international order, which wasn't even necessarily pro, British Empire. Because, of course, there are a variety of countries that had historical grievances with the English at the time, to finally put an end to Napoleon's conquest of Europe. But, of course, the Napoleonic Wars, an interruption of hegemonic power to the British Empire. Previously, if you want to go back to the 17th century, in the 1600s, around 1666, is the Second Anglo-Dutch War. This is a threat to Dutch hegemony in Europe and the New World. Where, of course, this is where right before the Glorious Revolution in 1688, but this is, which leads up to it, of course. But the Second Anglo-Dutch War, of course, the English get a hold of what would become sort of New England, what is considered New Amsterdam, so New York, that area. And, of course, Dutch hegemony on the high seas is then challenged by the English Navy. The Dutch do not have the capacity to rebuild. The later sort of industrializing and developing English, government, the English military, the English Navy, sets itself up to be the dominant naval sea power in that region. So, of course, the Second Anglo-Dutch War leads to a challenging power, the English, bringing down the Dutch Navy, and in doing so, Dutch hegemony both in Europe and the New World decreases. And then thirdly, is the First World War. So it's important to understand when looking at the book of world politics and sort of Organski's work, a lot of aspects of power transition theory are meant to explain why these conflicts happen. One of them, of course, being why does the First World War happen? We look at this through a contemporary lens of the bargaining model of war. And that is about the uncertainty of commitments, alliances, and the ability to stay true to those commitments, because there are challenging powers in the area that may or may not make it easy for you to be good on your word or your commitments on your alliances to other countries. We see this especially in the First World War between, of course, the British Empire and Germany, particularly through Germany's vast, rapid industrialization of its naval forces. The British Navy has engaged in numerous battles in World War I with the German Navy. They're some of the most destructive and most, bloody naval conflicts in modern history, at least contemporary, right, with modern, naval crafts and dreadnoughts, whether that's the Battle of Jutland or others in the English Channel and around in the North Sea area. But the First World War, of course, is an example of how these rising, later industrializing powers can then challenge sort of this existing, set of alliances and international order, this alliance system that had been put in place, which, of course, is later an extension of the 19th century, idea of the balance of power. But as we've mentioned earlier with power transition theory, that even attempts to have a balance of power, it eventually gives way to conflict, because the existing international order cannot accommodate for the fact that there are rising powers that are unsatisfied with the international order and wish to challenge that system for either greater access to military resources, access to land for the economy, and access to capital. Keep in mind, areas like the Alsace-Lorraine region, which the Germans got from earlier, about 20 some odd years ago, were vast, coal mines and areas for natural resource extraction that would give the Germans the necessary military power they need to industrialize. So we are seeing power transition theory in action historically through various aspects of industrialization, the challenging of the international order. The theory fits very well and nicely for what he's trying to explain. It's putting a hypothesis before what he's already seeing. And in a way, that's a lot of how we sort of explain things in international affairs and relations. And as we had mentioned earlier, of course, is that we're seeing it even more recently, right, when we talked about the European Union and we talked about the reunification of Germany. The existing international order, of course, at the time, the Soviet Union, dissolves. It becomes the various members of the Russian Republic and iridescent claims of territory. But of course, you have a unified Germany. Unified Germany industrializes and rebuilds long after the United States, post-World War II and post-Soviet Union. And they're now in a position to sort of challenge the existing international world order. And that's where we're at. And we're seeing it now between, especially at the beginning of the Trump administration, right? You're getting the rhetoric from the United States that it wishes to pull back from this international system. There's great dissatisfaction from parties like Macron and like Angela Merkel in Germany and France. So that's where you're starting to see a lot more of this talk about a European Union military, less dependence upon the United States from Germany and from France especially, a lot more military buildup of both the French and German militaries respectively, and an engagement with other powers in the region, especially through engaging with, say, Russia in terms of energy policy and diplomacy. So a challenge in more direct open communication with the geopolitical rivals to the existing international order, the United States. And we'll talk about this in a later stream when we talk about the German elections when it gets closer to September. We'll be talking about this again and how the Germans are sort of moving closer towards Russia and away from the United States, at least a little bit diplomatically. And we'll be talking about power transition theory. We'll be talking about offensive realism and, of course, Russian energy policy towards the European Union. But all of these factors talk about latter and posterior industrialization and their development of markets and access to systems that don't necessarily work with inside the international order. Because, again, the United States has put sanctions on the Russians, and there are countries like France and Germany and others that are willing to engage with Russia in trade, especially with oil and the liquid natural gas for energy. So you're already seeing that sort of posterior industrialized state, the reunified Germany, challenge the existing international order. So we're already seeing a more recent contemporary version of power transition theory in action. But yes, so we're already seeing that there. But we'll be talking about Germany and its elections and the EU and organized Germanism in a later stream, I promise. But we're going to do that closer to the German elections. So we'll do some rank punditry in the future, but we're not going to do it about the United States elections. We'll be doing it about the German parliamentary elections. But those are some contemporary examples of power transition theory in action. So now the fun part of the lecture is that we get to talk about its application in current international relations. So power transition theory tells us that we always have to ask the question, who is weaker? Because the weaker party is willing to challenge the existing international system. So that really makes an interesting question, because we talk about the decline sort of the existing international order, but does that mean that they're necessarily the ones that are going to be acting out? Does that mean the United States is going to be acting out? Or does this mean that those sensing the weakness of the existing international order are finally going to start, poking the bear, so to speak, and taking action? Give me 1 second. Hold on. Little delicious bit of cranberry juice to keep it all going. But that's the question we have to ask ourselves, is technically who is the weaker military party, or at least who is the weaker of the two, posterior industrializing nations. So the ways that you could look at this could be things like Russia, right? So post-dissolution of the Soviet Union, Russia does have a domestic manufacturing capability. It does have a significant, natural resource economy that it can operate under and has been utilizing for leverage against the international system. We've talked about that when we talk about like the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, or we talk about, oil, timber, various things that are not only increasing in value in the international markets, but as well as the fact that these resources are essential for, domestic manufacturing, as well as, energy policy abroad. So we're already seeing how that could play a potential factor. Of course, the big question, right, is about the state of affairs when it comes to, say, China. Would we consider China the weaker power of the two there? Well, they have a rapid and various industrializing base. Up until the last year and a half, we've seen double-digit economic growth from them. So we've seen that posterior industrialization definitely take hold. And they're utilizing the institutions to their own benefit. So there are those that would say, oh, China can play nice. And that's where you sort of get the neoliberal idealism that China can either democratize, which we don't think is true, or that they're happy with the international order because they can use it against the existing superpower, the United States. To an extent that we've seen that, right? Myself and others have claimed that the United States is a hard power country fighting a soft power war with the Chinese. And that may lead to, power transition theory not necessarily illustrating a hot conflict, but one in which powers transition through a different, unfair distribution of resources. And we're seeing this with, say, the Silk Road initiatives, the development and harassment of Association of Southeast Asian Nations, mainly U.S.-aligned trade partners. And of course, you've had more recently securing diplomatic and strategic initiatives between China and New Zealand, although Jacinda Ardern has kind of pushed back on that, talking about human rights issues. And of course, the Five Eyes agreement, which he's pulled out of. So there's already some tension there. But you can illustrate how at least these ideas of viewing the international system can be challenged. So it varies. But again, those are the questions that we have to ask. Who is weaker? How do we determine that weakness? Of course, the primary way that we can determine weakness, of course, is going to be, of course, through economic projection of exports. It's going to be the aspect of who can put their, currency in the hands of other countries. So we're kind of seeing that with what China's doing right now by trying to get African countries to adopt the Chinese currency and decouple themselves from the US dollar. And of course, whose analysis is worthwhile? Now, this, to me, of course, is the hardest question about examining international relations, is whose analysis is worthwhile. Now, this doesn't mean that you don't, if someone has a bad take or someone who has historically been wrong, doesn't mean that you should, take their word, with a grain of salt. I think you should do that with everybody. But you also need to keep in mind about where their sources are coming from or who they're credentialed by. If you're going to be listening to someone who works for the Atlantic Council, know that you're going to get a very pro-international order, pro-NATO, pro-US-led Atlantic Treaty sort of based opinion. In the same way that if you were going to work at a Confucius Center, right, at a university with a lot of Chinese money, you're going to get a very Sino-oriented viewpoint. So it's important that when we take a look at international relations and geopolitics, that the analysis is, of course, you have to be very careful about who you're looking at. and taking a look at how they're taking their perspectives into account, how they're manipulating the data. I just say this in general because it's important for us to understand how this operates. Now, does it really matter who is weaker, one shit versus another shit? Yes, it does matter who's weaker, at least in regards to our conversation and today's theory. The weaker party is typically the one that challenges the existing dominant order. So, for this instance, pertinent to our analysis, at least with power transition theory, it's important for us to ID what we would consider the traditionally weaker party, because they're the ones that are most likely to initiate or instigate the likelihood of conflict, or try to move or reform the existing international order towards their favor. And now, if the dominant order can no longer block them out, or they wish to encourage their development, say those who believe in the idea of managed decline, then yes, it won't matter. However, it's important for us to ask this question, at least in regards to this theory and how we can apply it to contemporary international relations. So the applications to these questions to the current state of affairs. You have the two largest powers, the United States and China, their various spheres of influence and the status within the international system. Now, how's the international system being necessarily challenged? Well, it's being challenged at least through bureaucratic means. We see this especially with the United States, and we see this mainly through bureaucratic means, especially when it comes to, say, the United Nations, the World Trade Organization. China has been very effective at maintaining a positive view, or at least a more positive spin on those organizations and how it affects them. Trade is vital, of course, in the aspects to project power. Anyone within a realist school of thought will tell you that your ability to project power is only as strong as your economy. So doing things that can give you access to rare earth minerals, natural resources, and encourage, trade development, which is why we're seeing a lot more heavy influence in terms of foreign direct investment from China into, say, areas like sub-Saharan Africa, whether that's cobalt or bauxite mines, things that are incredibly important to the development of their economy and their military-industrial complex. So their sphere of influence is not necessarily one that we can say on the line of a map, this is where they're at, but more so rather where are they at economically. The good student says, empire might change, but liberalism progresses. Does it really matter if Britain was replaced by America? Yes, it does matter, in part because it matters for two reasons. One, in part because the United States' foreign policy towards, former colonial or Commonwealth countries, say like that of India or Australia, are vastly different than that of what the United Kingdom's was. And then two, you could argue that the liberalist, traditions of, say, the UK and the United States are different enough that eventually the United States becomes the dominant cultural and political force. So whatever exists of the United Kingdom or the Anglo tradition has been surpassed by the American one, which you could probably make an argument, at least nowadays, is worse than what was the Anglo tradition. What do you think China's low birth rates will do to its power? See, this is the fun question with power transition theory, right? Is because we know there's a demographic problem with China. And if there's a demographic problem with China, similarly to how the United States has a demographic problem, they both have demographic problems, but they're different, right? But China's got one where net zero immigration or a loss of immigration and low birth rates, to a point where now you have a population equal to the size of the United States. So 330 some odd million people that are over 65 and not working, or at least minimally working, and don't have a pension system or a social security safety net. That's going to significantly impact your ability to spend capital on, say, war. You have a cultural tradition of taking care of those within the family, so intergenerational households. So the question becomes, will China act now, or will they try and solve the demographic problem and then come back to it? So that's the big question, is whether or not they fix the demographic problem, they find a way to address that, or, of course, the rapid amounts of industrialization, trying to culturally, subjugate other ethnic groups into the area to be sort of more like Han Chinese, which, of course, reduces the birth rate. It will significantly affect their ability to project power. Now, whether or not they act in the meantime before that really leads to the demographic bubble popping is a whole other question. And power transition theory tells us that most likely they will try to challenge something before that bubble bursts to secure some sort of international order that they can control within their own hands. They may have to act now, but whether or not, I don't know. That becomes the question, is whether or not they act before or after the demographic problem. Power transition theory and a lot of other realists will tell you that potentially they will act beforehand, because now would be the time to sort of challenge the United States while it's at its weakest. Or they may just sit and wait. Historically, they've done that. Anytime that China sort of gets right at the edge of pushing itself out there internationally, it usually regresses and moves more isolationist. So that's sort of what we're going to see here. And that's the big sort of question, I guess, leering on for a lot of us here that are talking about that. But yeah, and as for the question of Chinese foreign investment, if it's sustainable, I personally don't think it's sustainable. Between currency manipulation and the international order sort of being wary of the Chinese currency, you're seeing a lot of African countries sort of get screwed, which of course in turn makes them a vassal state of the Chinese. But I think other nations are sort of turning their eye to that and sort of recognizing that, trying to decouple their currency from sort of the world reserve, which is the dollar, is not within their best interest. I don't think it's necessarily sustainable in the long run for these countries, but China will probably get what it wants / needs from them by the time that it's too late anyway. But yeah, so those are the questions of what is to come. But of course, power transition theory doesn't just apply towards the world's superpowers, the dominant system. We also see it in terms of regional hegemonies as well. The Middle East is a really good question when we talk about, say, Saudi Arabia and Iran. We've seen that Saudi Arabia is the dominant hegemon in the region in terms of the Middle East. Now we're seeing, of course, these challengers being propped up, say, by, whether that's Houthi rebels propped up by the Iranians, and the Iranians getting money from, say, the Chinese and through the Russians and through other, sort of terrorist groups that wish to challenge Saudi authority. So, I mean, you can see it being taken place even on a regional scale as well. And like we talked about last week with the Grand Renaissance Ethiopian Dam, is that Ethiopia is putting itself to challenge the dominant hegemon in the area when it comes to Nile River politics, which, of course, is Egypt. So the nice thing about power transition theory is that not only does it work for, large-scale international projects, it works excellently in our ability to analyze regional conflicts and the disparities of power, resources, and political influence in the in regional affairs as well. So it's a really great way to examine sort of the power politics and the power plays of smaller countries as well. Does technical advancement lead to the same value systems becoming common no matter who has bigger guns? That's a really good question, the good student. Does technical advancement lead to the same value systems becoming common no matter who has the bigger guns? Well, technical advancement typically leads to the advancement of bigger guns. So to me, it would be that the technical advancement and whoever can disseminate information, right? Because you can have all the military power in the world, but if you can't change things culturally through education, through popular culture, media, and information systems, you're not doing, you're controlling a territory that is going to be at least politically and culturally insurgent against you. So really, the technical advancement has to come with, say, communication and education. And in turn, of course, I think that leads to the bigger gun, or historically it has been. So, I mean, to me, I think it's indicative of the idea that maybe you would need both there, good student. I mean, technical advancement requires both hard power and soft power. I mean, does technology determine the system in which people have? Not necessarily. No. I mean, that's more of an anthropology question, perhaps. But does technology determine the value system in which people have? Well, okay, let's put that into perspective, right? So let's say the United States and the United Kingdom, right? Or at least historically, right? The United States had an Anglo tradition because it came from a variety of Anglo people. But when the settlers first came to the United States, they didn't have the same level of technology or industrialization that the people of England had, but they still had a similar value system. So I don't think that technology necessarily determines that value system. I mean, even today, people of various colonized groups still have a value system and a morality that is different to that of their colonizers, but they still adhere to old pre-colonial values. And I mean, it just depends upon the civilization, right? We talked about this with Samuel P. Huntington's concept of civilizational differences, where, say, the Islamic world isn't necessarily trying to become modern Islam, but rather Islamify modernity. So it does vary. But both the United States and the United Kingdom became liberal, right? I mean, yes, they both derive from that Enlightenment tradition. But I mean, it just depends. I think that it varies from culture to culture. They share a similar cultural and civilizational background, but if you were to drop, say, a variety of people in a different country or a different part of the world, it may be entirely different. I think it's important to keep in mind that they come from a similar cultural and historical background there, good student. Shrouded Hills, the Saudi military can take L's all day long in Yemen. They're no match for Iran. Yep, and the American taxpayer is still going to foot the bill, and it is rather frustrating. But realism focuses on material power, and some realists look at how values influence one perceptions. Values are secondary. Yeah, realism primarily looks at the material, and values come second. This isn't to totally disregard soft power, but soft power and hard power do go hand in hand when projecting sort of a strategic influence in an area, which is why it's important for you to not only have a big stick, but also have the ability to have a large megaphone as well. And so material power to me also includes the soft power aspect. But yeah, material power is essential there, Miguel. But with all that being said, and I'll get to chat in a little bit, I know those were some really good questions. And I really like getting good questions because A, it makes me think, and B, it provides good conversation. But to review, so what have we learned today? Is that we have learned about A.F.K. Organski. We've learned about the determinants of power, whether that's political efficiency, population size, and industrialization, and that growth that determines how power is distributed in an international system. We talked about how power transition theory is primarily believing that the world is hierarchical. Unlike Mearsheimer, it is primarily with an international order that is powered by the dominant global power, which creates an international system of order and trade in which they influence and they enforce and they direct. It is usually a weaker, dissatisfied power that is rising and industrializing that either reaches parity or near parity that will challenge that dominant institution in power on the global stage or regionally. It's not just on the grand scale international order. We learned that Organski is from Italy. We learned that he introduced world politics in 1958, where this theory comes from, and was a member of the Frankfurt School by working for the Institute of Social Research. We talked about how this works on sort of a pyramid scale of a dominant nation on top, but challenging powers right below, along with middle and smaller and colonial powers down below. Dissatisfaction in the rate of industrialization becomes the biggest determinants for when likelihood that challenge is to happen. We talked about the rates of growth, how conflicts will happen, and the various conflicts historically that this theory seems to tend to answer, specifically like that of the Napoleonic Wars and the First World War. We then applied it, of course, today in current international relations, talking about how we can determine who is the weaker power, how it's important for us to be very critical in our thinking about where we get our analysis from and who we read, and who benefits from the existing international order, talking about soft power, hard power, spheres of influence, and between the differences of the United States and China. We asked questions regarding to how power transition theory can apply to the rise of China, the question of demographics, what's to come, and here we are concluding our today's lecture on the question of power transition theory and where we're at. So this is where we are, and this has been our lecture today on power transition theory. This has been an excellent conversation, and now, of course, we're at the end of today's lecture, which means we get to have a very fun time addressing the Frog of the Week, so TFW. So that being said, let's get to the Frog of the Week, ladies and gents, and then we'll get to Super Chats, and we'll do a little bit of shilling, and then we'll wrap up just by chilling with you all and having answering a couple of questions. So, on to Frog of the Week. So the Frog of the Week is the African dwarf frog. Our cute little picture here. He's got his little beady black eyes. He's natively found along the equator of the African continent. You'll see them most primarily within Nigeria and Cameroon. They are also known as dwarf clawed frogs because they have little claws on both the back of their feet and on their hands that allow them to dig and scavenge for food. They are a primarily aquatic frog. You will see them on land, but they are primarily underwater for most of their life. They have an average lifespan of about 20 years. And unlike other frogs, they don't have any ears, no real ears at least. They have these lateral lines that move from the bottom of their necks all the way down their bodies that senses vibrations, sort of like almost like echolocation. They depend on the vibrations of everything else to help them determine where food might be, where other frogs might be, where predators and their mates might be. They will eat just about anything. They are not they're not necessarily a herbivore or carnivore. They'll eat both. They're omnivores, but they're scavengers, so they'll eat just about anything. And their claws allow them to dig in the dirt and underground, and as well as on the surface for food that they might have. They'll eat, fruits. They'll eat flies. They'll eat, plant detritus. They'll eat just about anything. And nowadays, here in the West, they are a common household pet if you can afford them. You got to make sure that they have a large enough space to be underwater. They don't need a lot of land within their tanks. So make sure that you have lots of water. Make sure it's an incredibly warm environment. Like I said, they're an equatorial species, so they're primarily found in sort of that tropical forest wet regions along the African continent on the equator. But that is the frog of the week, the African dwarf frog. If you are interested in seeing a frog be featured on the Sunday stream, all you have to do is either at me on Twitter, at 2bprudential, or you can DM me or just find my YouTube business email and send me a picture of a frog. Let me know what species it is, and it will be featured on the frog of the week at the end of every Sunday stream when we talk about our international affairs and geopolitics. But yes, this is the frog of the week. We talked about the African dwarf frog. He's definitely a cute one. And they're all good boys. So it doesn't matter what species you get, they're all good boys. Do an American frog next time? Yeah. So just like I said, DM me on Twitter, at me, email my YouTube account. I don't care. But if you're interested in seeing a different frog species on there, by all means, just let me know and we'll do that. Let's drop them in Australia and let's see what happens. Shrouded Hills, that's not fair to anyone who gets dropped in Australia. They'll be killed or eaten alive almost instantly. Not fair at all. Everything in Australia wants to kill you, including the women. do Pepe next. Okay, that's perfectly fine. I will happily do, we can do Pepe. I just saw that get mentioned like 20 times. So yeah, we'll do Pepe. That's totally okay. I saw, hey, Don. Yeah, we'll do Pepe next. That is fine with me. So with that being said, let me get into the super chats and we'll get started there. Alrighty. Let's see how this works. DC Perspective for $5. I'm poor, but I like this. Well, thank you, DC. I greatly appreciate it. And like I said, if you're poor, you don't have to donate, but thank you so much. Don says, hey, man, congratulations on the monetization action. Thank you so much. I greatly appreciate it. With Remnant Hearts, is this from personal experience? I don't know what that's in relation to, but I'll have to look for your question there if you have one. Is this from personal experience, like the frogs and how they're like taken care of? No, but I follow a lot of frog owners, and it's my way of getting some dopamine into my system. So I just know a lot of useless stuff. When I'm on my own and I have the ability to take better care of myself, like post-transplant, I plan on getting a frog as a pet. John Jackson for 25. Oh my gosh, thank you so much. Good Lord. Any plans in the future to discuss community building and self-sufficiency for what's to come? My wife and I just started a garden and are getting chickens soon and are convincing our neighbors to do so. Thanks. Well, John, regarding the... Oh, okay. Well, John, what I can tell you is that I think it's important for us to have self-sufficiency and to take care of ourselves. I can talk about that in the future. I don't necessarily have the most experience. I would say I'm an amateur. I do plan on gardening. I do plan on taking care of livestock, and I'm trying to convince my family to do so. Right now, we take care of some bees, but that's about it. I can definitely do more research, and I can put something together. If I'm going to do a video or something like that, I'll make it a live stream most likely, and I'll have maybe Radical Liberation on. Mr. Carson is definitely the man's man to go to for that, John. He's got, his family and a farm and everything like that. So that would be who I would talk to, John. I will let you know in the future because that's a lot that you asked for that question. So I will definitely put a video or a live stream together, and I'll make sure that you're aware of it. So again, thank you so much for the donation. With Remnant Heart saying, regarding the Aussie ladies. No, not personal. Well, actually, yeah, because there's a woman who broke my heart who was half Australian, but that's a story for another time. And what am I going to name my frog? I don't know. Maybe I'll have you guys name my frog. I'll put it to a poll. Who knows? Let's see here. There were a couple of super chats from earlier that I'm now going to have to find. Here we go. Let me find them now. Pop out chat. I have no idea how any of this works. Half Australian, that's even worse. Froggy McFrogface. Yeah, that might just be the chat that I do, or the name I pick for the frog. And let's see here. Who else mentioned me? Mark says the Prudential is channeling his inner patriarch. Nice. Yeah, well, I mean, thank you. I appreciate it. I'm not necessarily what I would consider a patriarch, but I appreciate it. Thank you. And then let's see. Mr. Patriarch put in one. Congrats on the monetization. Well, thank you so much. I greatly appreciate it. And if there's anyone that I missed, Creator Studio even. Well, now there are Super Chats tab in the background. Creator Studio even. Oh my. Okay, let's go do that. Hold on. YouTube Studio. I see. I'm brand new to this. I have to figure everything out. I didn't think I'd get this far. There we go. Okay, that solves that problem. Found them. Gotcha. Mr. Patriarch had sent in 14 South African. Thank you so much. Yay, monetization. Well done, man. Keep it up. Thank you. Chris Raposo for $10 Canadian, saying congratulations on making monetization. Well, thank you so much. I greatly appreciate it. You guys have been awesome. Yeah, thank you, Don. I figured it out. I'm not not gonna boomer it up. Now I know for next time what I'm doing. But yeah, okay, awesome. I appreciate it. Thank you, Don. If a war with Iran and the Saudis happened with only allies in the Middle East, who would win? Most likely Saudi Arabia then, but that if it's only allies within the Middle East, then Iran. If it's only within allies in the Middle East, because if the Saudis don't have American dollars to back them up and American military hardware, Iran wins rather quickly, in part just due to geography. You've got Saudi Arabia more or less having to deal with Yemen issues. Iran has the ability to exert influence into Iraq, not to mention the, Gulf region and water-wise is going to be challenged by, of course, the Iranian Navy, and the influx of dollars that it's had recently would put it in the perspective to win. Is the Middle East being slowly corrupted by Western culture? Well, good student, I think that entirely depends on who wins the political battle of the future. Does the reaction to modernity from the West and liberalism, is it challenged and met with a successful challenge by that of the sort of Islamist nationalist attitudes that we've seen from areas like the Muslim Brotherhood, Erdogan? Most likely they will eventually lose, as we've seen historically. However, their reaction will be far more violent than what we've seen here in the West. So they will eventually lose, most likely, as history tells us. However, they will not go forth into that good night very quietly. And it will not, it will be bloody, and it will not be pretty. If you think like the yellow vest riots that we see in France over policy here will happen, the youth might be very liberal, but I think the older nationalist Islamist reaction, there's going to be a culture clash there. And I think it will be very interesting to see what the Islamic world looks like in 10 to 20 years. In part, I think you're sort of seeing that now with a lot of Western intervention, with the attitudes that we're seeing with the focus of women's rights and women participation in the workforce in areas like Afghanistan from the United States. Does economic liberalism lead to a liberalizing of social mores? Historically, we've seen that to be the case, yes. Imagine, stomping on a human face forever if neoliberalism wins. Yeah, it's pretty much what it's going to be. It's going to be those like $600 leather boots standing on the face of humanity, being worn by someone who says "eat the rich" while weighing 500 pounds. Who would win in a Russia versus EU war with England? That's a really fun question. If you could rephrase that, I would appreciate it. Zoldor asking me how tall I am, 5'10", moving on. More peaceful Islamic nations in Southeast Asia tend to be more liberal. Well, I wonder how much that has to do with, say, Western economic involvement in, say, Southeast Asia, especially between, say, the United States and its influences there. Southeast Asia would be a great place for us to explore further on the Sunday stream. If you have any countries or things that are going on, good student, just at me on Twitter, and I can let me know. Manlet Don, what are you talking about? You're taller than you. The older generation are way more conservative than conservatives in the U.S. I think it will be like 10 to 25 years as the Islamic world is as liberal socially as us is now. Oh, that's fine. Probably. That's. I would say it's a very fine analysis to Yunka. It's probably right. Everyone is taller than me, though. That's okay, Don. Your beard makes up for it, and your absolute manliness. So don't you worry. Would I consider Chinese secularism to be liberal? No, I think that that's something entirely in its own end with a history of, say, Confucianism and a variety of legalism and other Chinese philosophies. I would not consider it to be liberal. It's definitely its own thing. Your bet on Ukraine and Belarus existing in their current forms by the end of this decade. Depending on what the United States and the EU does, Ukraine will probably hold out. Belarus is more or less a sure shot to be sort of the Lebensraum of Russia, and that's where I'm at there. Imagine not being 6 foot or taller. Well, I'm gonna just blame my kidney issue there that I've been dealing with my whole life as to why I'm not taller. That's all I'm gonna say there. And how old am I? I'm 25. What would be an ideal economic system? Oh, we could go all day. Fantasy dream economic system would be some sort of Austrian distributism, but I don't even know how that would work out. That's just me being, just me dreaming. Will Poland be the next superpower? Poland has the capacity to, if it maintains a high birth rate and maintains a strong economic alliance with, say, either the European Union or the United States. There are people like George Friedman who predicted that Poland could be a potential regional, like, hegemon in the area, which could lead to a global conflict within sort of the Eastern European area. So they have a potential to be a superpower, or at least a regional hegemony. So yeah, I mean, Forest Bomber, as for your questions on that, I would just say that any sort of iridescent territorial claim through either ethnicity or culture or historical claims typically get used for conflict in the past. Germany's done it with said Lebensraum. Russia does it with post-Soviet territories. So it would definitely happen. Why am I a manlet? Because I had shit kidneys growing up, and that affected how tall I could be. So ha. Are you studying international? I studied international relations in school. I studied foreign policy, international relations for my political science degree. So it just depends on what you would consider seminal reading. I would I got like I fell in love with the idea of foreign policy and foreign relations by reading The Next 100 Years by George Friedman. But what I will do, Shervan, is put a reading list together. So if you're interested in what I got into and what I like to read and what was important for you to read, I'll put together a top 10 books list for you all to do, sort of like what a academic agent has done for his economics books. So that's what I'll do. If you're under 6 feet, women look at you with disgust. I don't know. My body count begs to differ, but okay. What do you think of the Caspian Report? I don't actually read the Caspian Report, so I really don't have an opinion. I've been told that they have a bit of a bias, but I would have to actually read them myself and go for it from there. Russia making Crimea into a puppet Tartar republic, based or based. What countries do you think will collapse in the next 15 years? 15. I would say the Mexican government's a potential one to look at, depending on how long we want to keep up the idea that Mexico has a legitimate government. So I don't know. That could be a fun stream that we could do, is talk about collapse. So Christian Populist, what I'll do is I'll probably put that on my list of Sunday streams to do, which will be the concept of a failed state, how nations collapse, and that might be a topic in the coming weeks. But speaking of in the coming weeks, in 2 weeks from now, the Sunday stream at the end of May, so on the 30th, I'm going to have Kevin Dormis come on, and Kevin is going to be talking about neoclassicalism and Russian grand strategy. And we're going to have a great conversation about that. He sent me some literature for me to read up on. So it's going to be a good time. And I think that it'll be a lot of fun for us to go over some more conceptual aspects of foreign policies, also how we view Russia as well. And because I promised, so I'm going to do some shilling now. We're going to move on. What I am going to do now is let you know about a wonderful, important, my friend DC Perspective. He does have a Substack. So this is his most recent piece. He put it out 9 hours ago. So if you're interested in what he has to say, DC Perspective is on Substack. You should read his piece. He does a lot of fun stuff on Zoomer politics, and he gives me a perspective of what the youngins are thinking. So you should go give it a read. There it is right there, and I'm going to put the link in the chat for you all to enjoy. So when you're done with today's stream, be sure to give that a read. And like I said, we are also monetized now, but if you want to provide a recurring donation, I would greatly appreciate if you were to take a look at my Subscribe Star page, which is going to be now on screen. And if you prefer a monthly donation as well, by all means, go for it. And this is where I can be, and I would always appreciate it. What I appreciate more than anything, of course, is if you like and share the videos. If you like what I have to do, or if you want other people to see the foreign policy stuff that I talk about every Sunday, you sharing the stuff, letting your friends know about it, coming them by and having them watch and having them subscribe to the channel, I greatly appreciate that more than anything, more than monetary stuff. To me, the fact that more people are growing, the fact that we're about to cross 2,000 subs, we just hit over 1,800 today, I am beyond happy with what we're doing. And all of the money that gets put into this goes right back into the channel. I'm technically a Zoomer prude. Yeah, I know, but I can remember 9/11 ouchie like it was yesterday. So to me, that's my difference there, is my separation. And of course, links are in the description. And I'm also on Telegram. I'm beginning to upload my backup stuff to BitChute. I heard that once Odyssey has its live streaming stuff available to everybody, I might also be doing a live stream on Odyssey on occasion. So all sorts of stuff are coming in the future. The channel's growing. I'm really happy with how things are going. So I'm excited. Read my comment as well. Did I miss something out there? Oh, yeah, I know. The more trad I become as I get older, the more I kind of regret my youthful indiscretions. I had too many reruns to remember. Yeah. But okay, guys. With all that being said, I will have 2 long-form videos coming in the next couple of weeks. One on the politics of masculinity, and then one that I'm sort of working on is what would a reactionary foreign policy look like. And so we'll be covering those in 2 long-form scripted videos in the near future, so stay tuned for those. And with all that being said, you guys have been awesome, and tune in next Sunday. We're going to be covering some more international affairs stuff, and if you want to see a different kind of frog on Frog of the Week, all you got to do is at me. If there's a topic that you're interested in, also let me know. I'm always available for a good conversation and a good topic being suggested by my viewers. And until then, guys, this has been the Sunday stream. I will see you all next week. Be prudent, everybody. I love you.